the man that put a lot of time, his own money and work into the making of Bigfoot, the inside story of the Roger Patterson film. Mr. Greg Long. Greg, are you out there?
Yes, I am.
How are you this evening?
I'm very well, thank you.
Well, I guess you know, you and I and our other fellow colleagues on this project, I don't know if you've gotten bashed yet today, but I understand that we've got somewhere around 1,600 texts and emails saying we're this, we're that, and everything else, and the Patty film is the greatest and realest thing in the world. But, you know, by us collectively, we are going to tell the truth and let everybody know around the globe, starting tonight, how this whole thing came about and who the culprits were, who the people that deceived all of us in mainstream America, and who those people got onto this money train and has been riding it for almost 50 years come next year. So what I'm going to do until our first break, Greg, I want you to tell everybody how you got into this whole deal and how you went through the making of that entire book and how long it took you and what you had, all the money
Certainly.
you got.
I've had a long-time interest in, paranormal subjects, not just Bigfoot, but, unidentified flying objects, spirits or ghosts or what have you. I mean, there's a whole range of paranormal topics that we could all talk about. I'm sure we all have had interest in them one time or another. But I was transferred up to this state of Washington from my job in Oregon and realized that there was Yakima, Washington was only about 2.5-hour drive from my home where I had relocated to. And I had been going out to the Yakima Indian Reservation to talk to fire lookouts there who saw strange objects in the sky. That's a totally different story. But in doing so, Roger Patterson's name would come up among the residents there. And I had heard of Roger Patterson, of course, the film, having seen it on television for many years. I was curious about the film and also the man behind it, Roger Patterson. By talking to some residents there, I was given some names of people who were very open to talking about Roger, who he was, his character. And suddenly I found myself inundated with so much evidence, so many stories from so many people in that community that I eventually discovered the man who wore this Bigfoot costume, and that's, of course, Bob Hieronymus. I ended up doing over 40 interviews, almost all were audio taped, in these individuals' homes, some, of course, by phone. Did a research in newspaper files. I looked into criminal records, the background of Patterson himself, the background of Bob Gimlin, Bob Hieronymus, Al Diatley, of course, who was Roger Patterson's brother-in-law, who funded Roger's expeditions, as he called them, to look for Bigfoot. And a story finally fell into place, which absolutely shocked me, that this film was simply a hoax. It was planned and organized by a small group of people. Bob Hieronymus, having been and still is a tall man, a very husky and well-built young man at the time, was invited to wear a Bigfoot costume. He, in fact, put it on there in the back of Roger Patterson's house. Patty Patterson, Roger's wife, actually was standing at the kitchen window and looked at Bob Hieronymus put it on. And so many facts came out about this case that it was quite obvious that it was carefully planned out by a man, Roger Patterson, who actually was chronically unemployed and had a history of conning people. Even Rene DeHinden, who is no longer with us, who was a famous Bigfoot researcher himself and ultimately made money off of Patterson's film, told me in an interview that Patterson was a crook, but that we should ignore the fact that he was a crook and look at the film only. And that was really the evidence, was the film and not the man behind it. But for me, I don't like lies. I don't like liars. I like honesty. I like forthrightness, and I like facts. And so I've concluded, after all those many interviews and 4 years of research and writing, that it indeed is a hoax. And that's how it all came about. Initially, my being close to Yakima, my ability to get over there quickly, and simply dig into the stories, and that's how it all came about.
Okay, so by saying that, how the whole thing came about, why don't you go into the part of who you went to talk to first and how it evolved then when you found out that, oh my gosh, there was people actually funding this thing. Oh my gosh, the brother-in-law had something to do with this. And oh, by the way, it wasn't really, this whole movie was not shot the date that they all said it was in October of 1967. And during this whole time, there was some criminal problems going on. I understand that he never returned a camera. He owed people money. There was warrants out for his arrest. Why don't you take it from there?
Sure. The way that I got onto the story was I was actually interviewing a man who had some sightings of UFOs. He claimed they were UFO sightings, and I wanted to know about that. And Roger Patterson's name came up. I don't recall the exact. I think we were having breakfast, and his name came up. And I said, "Well, did you know Roger Patterson? What can you tell me about him?" He said, "Well, there's one man you ought to talk to. His name is Les Johnson. Les Johnson, who lives up the road a piece, he'll talk to you about Roger Patterson." Well, it was several months later that I had the opportunity to go back to Yakima, and I had found Les Johnson's phone number, and I phoned him, and I said, apparently you know something about Patterson. He said, "Oh, yeah, I know all about Roger Patterson, and I can even tell you who wore the Bigfoot suit." And, of course, I was floored and shocked by hearing this, and I said, "I'll be right out." So I went out to see him there in Tampico, which is west of Yakima. It's a small community, and that's where Roger Patterson had lived much of his adult life. And I interviewed Les Johnson, who gave me more names, and these names became leads, and I began interviewing more and more people. It would take me hours to tell you the exact sequence of who I interviewed first, second, and third. But it didn't take long, in fact, in this first interview, to find out the name of Bob Hieronymus. I approached Bob Hieronymus without warning one day on the weekend, and he came to the door. I'm sure he can tell you about this. And he was holding, I believe, a granddaughter, and he seemed like a very normal individual. He was tall and, as I said, well-built. And I told him, "I understand that you are the guy who wore this Bigfoot suit." Well, he sort of stammered around that and said, "Well, I don't know what you're talking about," and so on and so forth. And I think I'll get myself a lawyer, which right away rang bells in my head. There's something going on here. I finally contacted his lawyer. I found out his lawyer was, after a second phone interview, or rather the first phone interview with Bob Hieronymus, and found out he did have a lawyer. I contacted the lawyer. He was not going to reveal the information to me, but said that this involves some well-known people in the community. And that's more than Bob Hieronymus, okay? And I thought, well-known people. Well, if you take a look at some of the literature that's been published decades ago, Al Diatley is a very wealthy businessman who founded a company called Superior Asphalt, and has made millions and millions of dollars in paving roads in Washington and also other parts of the Southwest. And if you find that literature, you'll find that he was funding Roger Patterson in making these expeditions. So I now had a name of someone who may know about this story as well. Of course, Patty Patterson's name had come up in conversations with Les Johnson, and I approached her. She allowed me to go into her home. At that time, my wife was with me, Pat, and we sat down, and I told her there's a name of a man who wore the Bigfoot suit, and I gave her the name, and she hemmed and hawed, and, "Well, I don't think I've ever heard of that person before. I don't know who you're talking about." I showed her a photograph which shows Bob Hieronymus, Roger Patterson, and numbers of other cowboys on horseback who were participating in making a movie with Roger Patterson, which was basically about hunting for Bigfoot. And I showed her Bob Hieronymus' picture, and she said, I don't really know who that is. Well, that's surprised me because Tampico, Washington is a very small community. I'm not going to tell you the population. I don't know. It's probably no more than several hundred people at the time. And it would be virtually impossible for her not to know Bob Hieronymus, especially since he put on the Bigfoot suit in the backyard of her home. But she was a very ungracious woman and gave me no information, refused to be interviewed. And so I knew I was not going to get very far with her. I then attempted to interview Bob Gimlin because his name, of course, is associated with his filming. And he refused to be interviewed at all. His wife protects him from the press. She's very, very jealous of people actually interviewing him. Bob Gimlin, of course, is now the sort of the hero of this whole story. He's the darling of the current generation of big hunters because he can go and tell his fish story. You know, I'm saying big fish story because the Bigfoot that he saw was originally 6'1", and over the years it grew to be 6'4" tall, by the way. So he has his famous fish story, but he's protected very well by his fans and his groupies and newbies. But that's kind of basically how it took off. Was through Les Johnson. It led me to Hieronymus rather quickly. It led me to a lawyer, and I continued my interviewing and finally approached Bob again. And by this time, Bob knew that I was interviewing countless people in the Yakima Valley area, and he finally met with me and with a friend as well, and he told me that he wore the suit, and he agreed to a taped interview. We met him in our motel room. Pat and I had a motel there in Yakima, and he came in with his wife, and let me tape his confession, if you will. And he mentioned, in fact, other people involved in this, Aldi Atley and Patty Patterson.
Okay, so you brought us up.
And I could go on, but I think you have some time limitations.
No, well, we do, but I really put some time for you because, you know, this book of yours, The Making of Bigfoot, the behind the story of the Patterson film, is just, as far as I'm concerned, remarkable. And I want the people out there to know what you've done is stupendous, okay? And you had the guts and courage to come forward. And throughout the years now, since your book has been published, you've been through hell, to say the least. You know, well,
the immediate reaction was that I'm a liar, and of course the same was launched on Bob Hieronymus. Not only was he called a liar, but called a drunk. And the reason why they called him a drunk is that Bob Hieronymus likes to have a beer or two at a local tavern. I know him. He's not an alcoholic, and he's not a drunk. But they smeared him upside and down. Matt Moneymaker is a name of a person who has a site. I don't recall the name of it, Bigfoot Forums or whatever. And I managed to join that forum and watch the insults pour in on an hourly basis. People filled with anger and outright hatred of me and this story and Bob Hieronymus. And it began to reveal to me an unfortunate, sordid, dark side of Bigfootology, if you will. There are many people in the field that I think have an inability to use common sense and reasoning powers and live in a world of fantasy and emotional confusion, if you will. They've taken the subject of Bigfoot to the point of a religious belief, a blind religious belief, and tied that religion to this 1 60-second hoax film. And they cling to that and hold that close to themselves. as being the proof and evidence of the existence of Bigfoot. And by the way, let me point out, I don't disbelieve in the existence of Bigfoot. There's too many stories of Bigfoot, I mean good witness accounts of Bigfoot, that this creature may truly exist. How it has managed to elude capture and killing, I can't explain that. He apparently is an extremely intelligent creature. But so it's not that I have any problem with the Bigfoot creature per se. My experience with them and their reaction to my book was, this is a very sorry, sad group of people who refused to read the book outright or just simply smeared it and said it's all lies. To my knowledge, none of them have ever followed up on any of the witnesses that I interviewed, and certainly no one ever visited me to talk to me personally about my research. And that's what happened to me. Is I was torn apart. Luckily, I had some news stories put out. I had some people who visited me and interviewed me and did a good job in hearing me speak the truth to them. But overall, the Bigfoot community hates the book, hates Hieronymus, hates anyone associated. And I probably include you, Tom.
Oh,
you're probably on that list of those who are now hated.
I love it. But here's the thing I want to point out to my listeners around the globe, if you would, Greg, because the day you told me this, and ladies and gentlemen, you can go to Bigfoot Live and BigfootLiveRadio.com, and you can see what he looks like, he and I together. If you just go there on the icon on top where it says Hoax of the Century, and you'll see Greg and myself, and next to us you'll see the Bob Hieronymus garage, in which he has this big picture stating Bigfoot lives here, and it's a picture of the Patty, due to the fact that he only lives a few houses down the street from Bob Gimlin, for those of you who don't know, which we'll get into this. And Bob Gimlin supposedly has this yellow sign that says something about Bigfoot crossing, and Bob himself, Hieronymus, will talk about that coming up pretty soon. But here's what I want you to bring out, Greg. It blew my mind when you told me nobody, when this footage broke and went worldwide and went crazy, nobody really in the media or in the industry really went up to Yakima and went to see the neighbors or talk to the neighbors or that city and said, hey, what is this guy like? And, oh, by the way, is there such a Bigfoot? Your response to me was, are you serious? Everybody knew it was Bob Hieronymus, and it was a hoax. It was a joke. Do you remember telling me that?
Yeah, I know. It was a shock to me that no one would have gone out and interviewed Patterson. I don't know specifically whether he was never interviewed in his hometown there in Tampico or Yakima, but I could find no evidence in my researches through newspaper files that any serious member of the media ever went out and talked to him and could have probed into his claims and could have done the same thing I would have done and would have exposed the truth early on. So they were completely irresponsible about it. I think they now view Bigfoot as a big joke. It's either a joke or it's a source of entertainment and revenues. It's big business for some members of the entertainment industry. So it's really been a dereliction of duty by journalists. And unfortunately, journalists today are probably, I hate to say it, less journalists than they used to be many years ago. If you ever look at some of the polls that are taken about the public's perception of journalists, it's rather low. So no journalist job was done. I was shocked, as you were as well, just shocked that if they just hunted around and poked around, they would have gotten Bob Hieronymus's name. This may have been proven to be a hoax early on, but it was raised to the level of an icon in the field, and it became a massive money-making operation. Aldi Atley claimed in an interview to me that he had himself made $200,000 on it, which is considerably in 1967-68. I do recall interviewing a witness who saw Patterson driving around in a black Cadillac at one point. And Bob Gimlin made money. But by the way, Bob Gimlin was cut out of proceeds from the film because he was not allowed by his wife, as I understand it, to go on the road to promote the film, which Al Diatley and Roger Patterson did. They took the film out on the road and using what's called four-walling techniques. It's a technique used where you do massive advertising in a city or a town, generate big audiences to come into the theater, show the film over 1 or 2 nights, and then leave town and go to the next one. Massive advertising, huge audiences, and move quickly across the country. And that's what Al Diatley and Roger Patterson did. They went across the country and finally up into Minnesota. And Minnesota was the last real venue for showing the film because there was a hoax of I think it's called the Minnesota Iceman, was exposed as a hoax in Minnesota, and the public got turned off and felt, why watch this other claim of a Bigfoot walking through a dry creek bed in Northern California. That is, Patterson's film. But a lot of money was made off it initially, and of course Patterson ended up writing contracts behind other people's backs. In other words, he would write multiple contracts for exclusive rights to more than one television production company or independent production company and make money that way, and in the process made a lot of enemies. When he died, the film was passed on to Patty Patterson and Renee DeHinden, who wanted to make money out of it. John Green, the famous John Green, made money out of it. And there was ultimately a big fight over who had the rights to the film because Bob Gimlin couldn't take the fact that he didn't get any money, and he sold his portion to Renee DeHinden for $1 over a cup of coffee in a local coffee shop. So since then, Patty Patterson has reaped massive benefits from it. I don't know exactly how much money she's made, but my understanding is she's retained an attorney, and if she gets a request for a production company to use rights to it, she has them contact her lawyer, and then the film is provided in a particular format to the buyer, and they go ahead and use it for their own purposes. She's made a lot of money. I can't even tell you how much, but she's pretty much lived off the film as far as I can tell. It still does.
This, Greg, to your all your determination of going through all of the fact-finding information that you've gone through and all the people you've interviewed, tell me when you came across his record. I'm talking about record with the police and stolen goods and stuff like that. What went through your head?
Well, I immediately felt that he was obviously dishonest. I mean, you mentioned the camera. He did rent a camera from a local camera shop, and he never returned it. The camera shop owner made all the efforts he could to get the camera back, and Patterson refused to return it, so he was finally arrested by the Yakima County Sheriff and hauled into court. Ultimately, the charges were dropped. I don't know why. Perhaps it was just not worth dealing with this camera issue. The camera, I don't know what happened to the camera. Peter Byrne, who was at that time interested in the film, and he may be familiar to some of your audience members, and he's now in, I believe he lives in Nepal, dealing with conservation matters. He was interested in the film. He tried to track down what happened to the film and feels that perhaps Patterson had sold it. So who knows what happened to the film, but the owner never got his camera back. So that was kind of a red flag for me. I mean, can't this guy just return a camera? I mean, what's the point here? What's he trying to do? But that led to me getting files that showed he was delinquent always on paying bills. He never had enough money to pay even grocery bills. So creditors were constantly out after him, and I list all that in my book, The Making of Bigfoot. Creditors were always after him. Renee DeHinden told me himself that Patterson would started a sort of a Bigfoot club, and he would sell a book that he himself wrote. And DeHinden said that Patterson would receive checks for the book, but Patterson decided he wasn't going to send the book to them. So basically, he was committing mail fraud. But no, he didn't really want to work for a living. He made that note early on. He worked in a couple of jobs, like he was a roofer for a while, and then he stopped doing that. And then he worked in an auto parts store for a while and stayed a couple of hours and quit and told one of his brothers, "I'm never going to work for anyone again." So he basically lived off other people is what he did. And he also lived off of Patty Patterson's father. Patterson didn't live that far away. He and his wife, Patty, in the Tampico area, and Patty Patterson's father realized that unfortunately his son-in-law was sort of a bum, so he would buy groceries for them and help them and get along. And in fact, they couldn't even afford a house or any place, so he let them stay in one of his homes. He had more than one home. So Patterson wandered around and basically promoted Bigfoot in the community. And got a little following of various people, which I name in the book, and they would follow him around and support him and believe in him. And he went up and saw John Green at one point and got clippings from John Green, and he used those to create his book that he wrote, and he illustrated his book. He was a cartoonist, and so he had an artistic skill to what he did. And he was a pretty creative, thoughtful guy. You know, he had a lot of time on his hands, and he did interview Bigfoot, witnesses. I know that. And I think from all of his creativity and his time on his hands and the fact that he didn't want to work for a living, he conceived of this hoax. And my book does have some reference to how he did approach a camera store owner to get a motion picture camera that he could use, because he claimed that Bigfoot was appearing behind his house out there in Tampico, and then made reference to the fact that that he wanted to use the motion picture camera because he was having an ape suit shipped to him by bus from Los Angeles, and that's in my book. So he did a lot of, I think, preliminary hoaxing and testing out of cameras and how this whole thing would work. He put his book together, and he sold that to make money. He attempted to have Hollywood make a film about Bigfoot in general, and Aldi Atley went with him down to Hollywood, and they tried to generate interest there, but no one would buy his idea. And so finally what he decided to do is he'll make his own movie, and as I mentioned earlier, there's a photograph that shows Bob Hieronymus and Roger Patterson and others named in the book, who all were these sort of amateur actors on horseback that he had ride their horses behind his home, and they're in Tampico, and filmed them searching for Bigfoot. All he needed then was the Bigfoot itself, and that's where Bob Gimlin approached Bob Hieronymus in place of Roger and said, "You want to make $1,000? We just need to have you wear a costume." And so Bob Hieronymus, being interested in money, said, "Hey, why not?" I don't think Bob Hieronymus, and he can talk to this better than me, ever thought that he would be involved in producing a movie that would later be used to promote a massive money-making lie on the American public. He was simply a guy who was a little naive at the time and was interested in making some quick money, and so that's what he did.
$1,000 back in 1967 was a lot of money. I mean, what was it? $1.25 an hour people were getting paid?
Yep. And by the way, let me just quickly let you know that I looked into Bob Hieronymus' past. I wanted to find out if he had any criminal record. By the way, Bob Gimlin actually did. He was accused by the authorities there in Yakima of accepting stolen material from several people who were indicted, which included Bob Gimlin. I don't know the disposition of the case, but there was something a little little shady there about Bob Gimlin. But I looked into Bob Hieronymus' past. I thought there's no criminal record on him whatsoever. I talked to his former employers because he managed the several ranches there in Yakima before he finally became an employee with the Pepsi Cola, local Pepsi Cola distributing plant there in Yakima. And they came up clean. There was nothing on him that's suggested to me that he had ever participated in any criminal activity at all. And he also passed 2 lie detector exams, by the way. When this story began to broke, one was given by a Yakima County deputy sheriff, and then also he was given a lie detector exam on a show called Lie Detector, in which he passed that exam as well. So anyway, he became a participant and never got a dime for it. But the guys who raked in the money were Aldy Atlee, Patterson, Gimlin to an extent, and then, of course, Patterson's widow, Patty Patterson, Renee DeHenden as well. Okay. And I'm sure if this movie it continues to be accepted as the lie that it is, it'll continue to make money by Patty Patterson's heirs, who will be given the film. They'll go out and promote it. It could live on for thousands of years, couldn't it, unless it were completely and finally exposed as the lie that it is.
All right, without any further ado, let's get back out to Greg in Washington. How are you, Greg? And thank you for spending us the time the way you're doing, and you're doing a marvelous, phenomenal job. Let everybody know about some of those people, like that woman that's in our film, Hoax of the Century.
Yeah. Let's talk about her. Her name was Vilma Radford. Not Wilma, but Vilma, V-I-L-M-A, Radford, R-A-D-F-O-R-D. Vilma Radford, I did not know she existed until I stumbled across a news clipping. My wife and I were at the University of Washington going through the Yakima newspaper. Here was a little story about Vilma Radford. It dealt with Vilma Radford suing Roger Patterson. And I thought, well, what's going on here? Well, it turns out that Roger Patterson, fast-talking Roger Patterson, this was after his book came out. So this would have been late 66, the fall of 66, or into winter or spring of 67. This was, of course, his film was shot in October of 1967.
Allegedly.
Well, allegedly, yeah. That's the date that we're given. But I read this article and I thought, well, he's being sued. Why? Well, it turns out by my digging through files and finally reaching her, that Patterson had signed. She had signed a contract with Roger Patterson that he was going to borrow money from her and use the money to search for Bigfoot and make a film called Do Abominable Snowmen of America Exist, which, by the way, is the title of his book that came out in the fall of 66. So he came over and did quite a piece of showmanship in pitching this entire idea that Bigfoot existed, and I believe he had Bigfoot cast with him and his book and so on and so forth. And he wanted to see if he could borrow some money from her. He had found out through Jerry Lee Merritt, who's another character in all of this. He's a rockabilly star who died a number of years ago, but he lived in Yakima, and Patterson knew him. Jerry Lee Merritt had found out that Vilma Radford had been in a severe car accident and had a settlement. So Patterson figured if I can get my hands on this settlement, I'll need the money. I'll have the money that I need to go down to California and make this film and pay for my expenses. So she did loan him the money, and he never paid it back. When she found out that this film came out, his 60-second clip, she found a lawyer and attempted to sue him. And it never went anywhere because Patterson never had any money. He either got it short-term and spent it all through whatever means he could find it, And so she finally went out to his house there in Tampico and gained entrance into it and went in there and said, "I want my money." And he was just sitting there, and he looked at her and said, "Well, you ain't going to get your money because there isn't any money." And she couldn't do anything about it. So she eventually just dropped the lawsuit. But she was a very astute woman because she kept all of the files and notes and everything related to Patterson and clipped these things out of the newspaper in Yakima and had a considerable amount of information to show me. I met her several times and interviewed her personally and also videotaped her, which portion of that is in the DVD you have produced called The World's Greatest Hoax. And I think, obviously you studied it as well, is she never forgot it. She never forgot how she was scammed by Patterson. And I'm just very grateful that she spoke to me and was able to tell me her story. She kept repeating over and over again, "I don't like people who lie. I just don't like people who lie." And so she did a great thing as far as providing very strong evidence of one of his scams. But as I said, Patterson just didn't want to work for a living. And we have a lot of those people today, perhaps in the United States. I don't want to get into all of that, but sure, it would be comfortable not to work for a living, wouldn't it, Tom?
But I want to add something to this. Because I remember Patty Patterson telling me when I was there to see her, and I remember you telling me also through your investigative interviews with so many people, this guy was pretty artistic because he had all this time on his hands. And I remember Philip Morris telling me the story about he was creative enough to add the pendulous breasts. He had told him about cutting the eyes around the suit and shaving some of the hair and all that stuff.
Right.
She also added the shoulder pads from the high school that he obtained in the area. I mean, he was pretty astute to doing this because there were sculptures that he had made.
That's right. He sculpted the head of Bigfoot.
Yes.
Looked a little bit more like a Neanderthal head. But he worked in leather. He worked in carving. But he was a good tool. Used tools for making leather objects and such. He was artistic. He was an illustrator. He sold some of his paintings to several people in the Mathau Valley area, I understand. And I saw his paintings in the home of one of his brothers when I interviewed one of his brothers. I would say his perception of anatomy was not always totally correct, or his use of perspective, but he did a pretty good job, on painting and illustrating horses and cowboys on horseback and sort of Western themes. So, yeah, he was definitely creative, and he was drawing when he was a kid. His older brother told me that he took up cartooning and illustrating when he was in his teenage years. So, yeah, he was very perceptive. And so when he got the gorilla suit from Philip Morris, he knew he had to expand the shoulders. So he got football player pads to put inside the suit. The pendulous breasts, I'm convinced, came from, there's a famous story, and I hate to even say it was Albert Ostman because I may be getting that right for those historians out there. But there was a story about a Canadian who went hiking up in a mountain, and he came across a Bigfoot that was crouched down drinking water from a creek, which, by the way, is what Patterson said he saw when he and Gimlin came around a huge uprooted stump of a tree. There was this hairy figure squatted down at this in this very dry creek bed. But anyway, this particular Canadian saw Bigfoot, and it got up and walked away, and he could see that it had breasts. It was amazing. It had breasts, and it walked away into the woods, kind of like Patterson's film. The creature stands up and just walks away. But I think that's where he got the idea of the pendulous breasts. It also throws in an element that is so odd and strange that it makes it seem like it's real, because if you have a male Bigfoot, I guess you might as well have a female Bigfoot, right? So why not have something like that really gets your attention? But no, according to Morris, of course, he modified the suit in various ways, and you can tell if you look at the feet of that Bigfoot costume. They kind of look like slippers. They just don't look like real feet. They look like pads of some sort, the artificial latex feet of some sort. But and Hieronymus could tell you about the eye. If you take a look at the Bigfoot frame, one of the Bigfoot frames, I call it the look, where the Bigfoot looks at you, he looks at the camera. You blow that up and you can see there's an eye there that looks like it's reflecting light.